Looking at the economics on our corn and soybean operation, and with the economics we're currently in, those crops are basically a break-even crop. Small grains are basically a break-even crop, but they give us a number of other benefits by allowing us to reduce our herbicide use and giving us an opportunity to raise a cover crop like this and bring our livestock out of the pasture into the row crop land and add some more value to this cropland by grazing the cover crop mix that we're able to plant after small grains.
And another way I guess we pay for it is behind this wheat crop that's behind the camera here, we won't be using any phosphate or potash on that field. Hopefully we'll get by with one herbicide treatment. I know that if we use two, they will be less expensive than if we didn't have that wheat crop growing there before.
If we can be growing a crop like small grains as a cover very early in the year, it will start to compete and hopefully outcompete with some of our more troublesome weeds. And maybe we can start learning how to get away from so many applications of chemicals.
I heard a voice, and I turned around, there wasn't anybody there, and what it said was, "Get along but don't go along."
That idea, the idea of independence, has driven Iowa farmers for generations, and it's what led Dick and Sharon Thompson, along with Larry Kellum, to found Practical Farmers of Iowa in the 1980s. Then, as now, farmers were looking for ways to maintain profitability in a time of low commodity prices. And Dick's answer wasn't rocket science. It was a well-managed, diversified farm. Each year he recorded the profitability of the crops grown on his farm, and he used the rotation long used by his father, a 5-year rotation of corn, soybeans, corn, oats into hay, and hay. He compared that to the county average and published it every year in what he called Thompson Agricultural Alternatives. Now, most years his system came out ahead. What he found in 20 years of strict record keeping is, although the gross revenue may be more in a strictly corn-soybean system or continuous corn system, he spent less money on inputs like fertilizers, herbicides, seed, and fuel.
You can't buy it in the bag. You got to buy it. You got to use a system that whatever fits your farm to make it work, to control weeds, to have fertility, and that may be different for each different farm.
Matt Liebman came to Iowa in 1998 to begin work as a professor at Iowa State University. And in the 2 decades that followed, he studied a similar system under similar soils and drew some similar conclusions.
The idea for the project came from the observation that crop rotation systems are integral components of what most sustainable farmers are doing. And when I first arrived in Iowa in the summer of 1998, I didn't have plots already established, and I spent a good bit of the summer out at Dick Thompson's farm. I rode in the tractor with him and heard his views on different ways to manage crops and soils, different ways to manage weeds. And based on some of the things he was doing and some of the observations I made, it seemed like it would be good to set up a long-term experiment that allowed us to evaluate changes in crop performance, soil quality, and pest dynamics, and to keep track of the economics along the way. So the main experiment involves 3 rotation systems: a conventionally managed corn-soybean system, a 3-year rotation that has oats underseeded with red clover following the soybean phase of corn and soybean, and then the 4-year rotation has oats underseeded with alfalfa and another year of alfalfa hay. So we have these different levels of cropping system diversity, and then we've chosen to integrate the 3- and the 4-year systems with livestock in the form of harvested hay, alfalfa, and manure return onto the plots. And we had to figure out what would be the amount of manure that a given number of cattle could generate when fed the concentrates and forages harvested off the plots. So we try to balance the return of manure with what would be generated from the harvested crop products in the 3- and the 4-year rotations.
The findings of Matt and his colleagues have been broad. They have published numerous studies on the agronomic, economic, and environmental benefits of this diversified crop and livestock system. They've found that diversifying benefits soil health and fertility, weed management, disease suppression, and water quality, all while generating the same net return.
So the net returns are a function of what you spend and what you make selling your crops. And obviously if corn and soybean are worth a lot, the less often you grow corn and soybean, the less revenue you generate. On the other hand, it costs quite a bit of money to grow corn and, to a certain extent, soybean. I mean, you're spending money for hybrid corn seed, you're spending money for quite a bit of nitrogen fertilizer, and if you're spending money for gas to dry the crop in a wet fall, you know, it kind of adds up. So the reason the different rotation systems come out equivalent with regard to net returns is that even though we bring in less revenue in the more diverse rotations with oats and clover and alfalfa than we do with the conventional 2-year corn-soybean system, we spend less money to raise our crops.
The real metric is not gross dollars per acre, it's net dollars per acre. That's what you have to look at. Most people want to just compare the gross dollars. I say most, but a lot of people just say, well, what's the gross dollar difference? Well, that's not the issue, is the net. When you're all said and done, you're farming for net.
For many farmers, improving weed management and fertility and therefore being able to save on herbicides and fertilizers is a big reason to add a 3rd crop to their rotations.
When you start to look at the economics of things all the time, sometimes saving yourself some money really adds value to a crop. And that's where I think why I think oats are a great crop for in small grain production, because it gives you the advantage to get some weed flushes and get some weed growth, terminate the weeds after the oats are harvested, and really set yourself up for a really nice crop next year without the weed pressure that sometimes you would get. So
it's important to recognize that when we grow oats and when we grow alfalfa, we don't spray those crops. We do clip them after the oat harvest to suppress the weeds, and certainly the removal of 3 to 5 cuts of alfalfa in the year following the seeding is very effective for weed control. So just by increasing diversity to include oats and alfalfa or oats and clover, you reduce the number of years that you spray, and you can get a 33 to 50% reduction in herbicide load just by doing that.
You know, weeds just are very adaptable, and having that the small grains in there really breaks up the weed cycle, and it provides a different way of suppressing weeds that corn and soybeans simply don't have.
spring wheat, with the early planting date, it's very competitive earlier in the year as a cool season grass. It suppresses a number of those weeds that are trying to get started later in the spring. And so we saw a decrease in prevalence of water hemp, lamb's quarters, velvet leaf, kind of the three main weeds that we deal with on our farm. We saw a decrease in those, allowed us to reduce herbicide use because of that early season competitiveness.
If you want to develop a weed management program, you basically have to think about weed population dynamics the way you look at your bank account. You have a certain amount in the account. We call that the weed seed bank, and that's the pool of potential recruits that can emerge in a crop and infest it. And weed seeds have dormancy, so they can live more than 1 year. Different species live different amounts of time in the soil. So every time a weed is successful in escaping cultivation or spraying or mowing, it produces a certain amount of seed, and those seeds enter the soil seed bank if they're not intercepted and consumed by birds, insects, rodents, other things. Okay, so when those seeds go into the soil, a certain number of them die. They decay, they germinate at the wrong time and aren't able to make a new weed. Or they come out of the seed bank and farmers kill them with herbicides or cultivation. So when you want to figure out the dynamics of are weed problems getting better or worse on your farm, you really got to know how many seeds are you putting into the seed bank and how many of them are coming out. And of the ones that come out, how many of them are successful in infesting your crop. There's some other complications too. We have dispersal. Weeds can move in manure, they can move on animal hides, they can move on farm machinery. So it's possible to infest a field with a new species through immigration. Some people are working with special attachments to combines to grind up seeds that are picked up in the harvest operations for the crops. So that's a form of emigration. Anyway, if you do all the balances of what goes in and what goes out, you can figure out, okay, am I gaining or am I losing weed control? And diversified rotations give you a variety of options to create stress and impose mortality on weed populations. So you can do it chemically at different times depending on the crop. You can do it mechanically at different times depending on the crop. The crops themselves have different growth cycles, and so for instance some crops that are planted early like oats will have a major problem with early emerging weeds like giant ragweed if you don't control the weed. Other crops that are planted late like soybean will typically have problems with later warm season weeds like water hemp. So the kinds of weeds we have reflect the kinds of crops and the associated crop management practices, and when we move towards a more diverse system, we impose a wider range of stress and mortality factors on those weed populations. And by tipping the balance towards more death and away from seeds being deposited in the soil, we can begin to drop the weed seed bank to lower and lower levels, and that allows us to use less and less herbicide and to feel less anxious when we have to cultivate when the weather's not cooperating. In the 3 and the 4 year rotations, we started out with a pretty clear idea that because we're including red clover and alfalfa in the rotation sequences, and because we're returning manure back to the system, that the quantities of synthetic fertilizers we'd have to add based on soil test results would be less than in the 2 year system where we're managing it exclusively with mineral fertilizers. And that's been true over the last 12 or more years. We've been able to reduce our synthetic nitrogen applications about 90%.
The clover alfalfa that we plant with the small grain is one of the key things that we use for the fertility for corn. I'm not sure how much you get per acre from just the first year, but I would think it'd be 50 to 60 pounds of nitrogen per acre. And then of course if you can leave the alfalfa or the clover for a following year, then you can get up in the 150 pound area. And there's a couple old Iowa State publications that show no benefit to fertilizing corn after that hay year. So it definitely is part of our fertility program.
So in 2010 we had quite a bit of soil-borne disease called sudden death syndrome of soybean throughout the north central region. Iowa was particularly affected. It's a disease caused by a soil-borne fungus called Fusarium virguliforme, and it's favored by cool, wet weather. And 2010 contributed to major losses in soybean because of this pathogen, due to the weather pattern. That year we went out to the MARSDEN farm plots, and side by side, row to row for 275 feet, we could see the difference between soybeans planted in a 2-year rotation following corn with soybeans planted in 3- and 4-year rotations, where they also followed corn, but they had oats and clover or oats and alfalfa in the rotation. And these yield differences are really marked. So we had sudden death syndrome this year in central Iowa on our MARSDEN farm plots once again. We've been monitoring it every year since 2010, with the exception of 2012, we could see marked symptoms. This year, between the 2-year soybean plots and the 4-year soybean plots, we saw a 13 bushel an acre difference. Okay, we went from 48 to 61 bushels. Again, these plots are, you know, practically side by side, in some cases row to row, side by side. So it's what we're doing with the soil conditions through crop residues and manure application that seems to be creating conditions where the fungus is either suppressed by other organisms or isn't able to find an alternate host for the years intervening between soybean crops. Corn is an alternate host for this fungus, Fusarium virguliforme, and in each of our rotations, soybean follows corn. So that's similar in all the systems. It must be something else going on. And since it's so markedly different between adjacent plots, we can only imagine that something's happened in the soil. On average, we're seeing a 20 to 25% yield boost due to the rotations. So energy use goes down considerably where you grow oats and alfalfa and clover in rotation with corn and soybean, because the large energy consumers in our conventional Iowa ag system are fertilizers, mineral fertilizers, the gas to dry corn grain, and if you're doing some form of conventional tillage like chisel plowing, the fuel consumed in tractor operations. So where you move towards perennial crops, where you're not tilling the ground and where you're using much less nitrogen fertilizer, and where you're growing corn less frequently and having to dry it fewer years, you save a lot of energy. In our case, we save 50 to 60% of the fossil energy embodied in natural gas, tractor fuel, and fertilizer when we move towards the more diverse rotations. Well, spreading manure and making hay, and if you want to cultivate between rows, all takes more time than a conventional 2-year corn soybean system without manure. So we recognize that. The labor demand is mostly in periods of the summer for making hay that don't really conflict that much with corn and soybean activities. But yeah, it takes more labor.
You will have an possibly increased need for labor depending on how you incorporate it into your system, or you might have a different timing for that labor. You maybe keep your labor the same, but have a different timing for it. So instead of harvesting all of our crop acres in October, and October, November, we're harvesting a few of them in July. And so that gives us a chance to reduce the workload come October and put it in the middle of the summer when we might have more labor available to do that.
With oats and other small grains, when it's July, typically, I don't know if there is a down season for farmers, but typically July could be a time when you can get your combine out and spread your labor out a little bit. Maybe you have a hired hand that's looking around for something to do besides mowing. It's a great time to get that combine out, do some work, maybe have some seed ready for the next year, and also to get your combine ready for your corn and soybean harvest.
Next week, we'll talk about where small grains might fit into your crop rotation and how to choose a good variety for your operation.